The morning started like any other Tuesday, but the air in Whispering Pines felt heavy and metallic. I am a lead technician for Buyer Response Solutions, and we deal with the stuff people usually only see in movies. We got a level 2 emergency call from a resident who had discovered a massive structural leak involving outdated industrial cooling chemicals in their basement. These chemicals were not just toxic, they were highly volatile, and if they hit the groundwater, the entire neighborhood would be facing a multi-million-dollar environmental disaster. I pulled our heavy-duty response vehicle up to the main gate of the gated community and hit the intercom. My partner David was already sitting up in the back because time was of the essence. We were met with silence for a moment before a sharp nasal voice pierced through the speaker. It was Brenda, the self-appointed president of the Homeowners Association. She told us that commercial vehicles were not allowed in the community before 9 in the morning and that our truck was an eyesore that would upset the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I tried to explain the urgency of the situation, but she cut me off. She told me that she did not care if the house was sinking into a pit of slime because rules were rules. I looked at the clock and realized we were losing precious minutes. Brenda actually walked down to the gate in her silk bathrobe, holding a cup of tea, as if she were guarding a royal palace. She stood directly in front of the sensor bar and folded her arms across her chest with a smug grin. I rolled down the window and told her that we were responding to a hazardous materials leak that could affect her own property value if it was not contained. Brenda just laughed and said that I was using scare tactics to bypass the bylaws. She claimed that she had seen my type before trying to rush in and do unauthorized work. I showed her the emergency dispatch order, but she refused to even look at it. She told me to turn the truck around and wait at the gas station 3 miles away until the official business hours began. David was fuming in the back, and I could feel my own blood pressure rising. This was not just about a power trip anymore, it was about public safety. I told Brenda that I would be documenting this refusal of entry for the city council and the fire marshal. She just waved her hand dismissively and told me to have a nice day while she watched us reverse out of the driveway. As I backed the massive truck away, I saw the resident who called us standing on his porch a few houses down looking frantic. He was waving his arms, but Brenda just pointed at her watch and walked back to her mansion. We were forced to leave the site, and I knew that every second we spent sitting at that gas station, the chemical plume was spreading deeper into the soil. It was the ultimate display of ignorance and ego. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my tablet to start the logging process. If she wanted to play by the rules, I was going to make sure the city played by them too. I called my supervisor and told him the situation, and his voice went cold. He told me to stay put and that he was calling the legal department immediately. Brenda thought she had won a small battle over a parking regulation, but she had no idea she had just triggered a legal landslide that would bury her. We waited in the silence of the cabin, watching the minutes tick by while the ground beneath Whispering Pines began to saturate with toxins. It was the calm before the most expensive storm that HOA had ever seen. I looked at David and told him to get the industrial sensors ready because when we finally got back and we were going to need every bit of data to prove what she had done. The clock finally struck 9, and the gate buzzed open with a reluctant mechanical groan. We did not wait for Brenda to come back out. We sped through the entrance and headed straight for the client's house at the end of the cul-de-sac. When we arrived, the situation was far worse than I had anticipated. The smell of ammonia and sulfur was so strong it was stinging my eyes through the open window. The homeowner was white as a sheet and pointed toward his backyard where a patch of grass was turning a sickly shade of neon blue and shriveling before our eyes. The chemical had breached the foundation and was now leaching into the soil at an alarming rate. I knew immediately that this was no longer a simple containment job, it was a full-scale remediation project. We deployed the sensors, and the readings went off the charts within seconds. While we were setting up the containment perimeter, Brenda pulled up in her pristine, white SUV. She hopped out and started screaming about the orange cones we were placing on the street. She claimed they were a tripping hazard and that we did not have a permit to block the sidewalk. I ignored her and focused on the leak, but she actually grabbed David by the arm to stop him from connecting a hose. That was the final straw. I stepped between them and told her that she was interfering with a hazardous waste mitigation and that if she touched any of our equipment again, I would have the police there in 5 minutes. She scoffed and said that she owned the street and that we were just glorified janitors. But then something happened that wiped the smirk right off her face. One of her prize-winning rose bushes located right on the property line suddenly began to wilt and turn black. She screamed and ran over to it, demanding to know what we had done to her garden. I told her that the chemicals she blocked us from containing 3 hours ago had finally reached her property. The look of pure terror that crossed her face was almost satisfying, but the professional in me was horrified by the damage. The leak had moved through the underground drainage system, which ran directly beneath her backyard. Because of her delay, the cost of the cleanup had just tripled, and the liability was shifting entirely onto the HOA for refusing emergency services. Brenda started hyperventilating and tried to blame the homeowner for having the chemicals in the first place, but I reminded her that the homeowner had tried to fix it and she had been the one to stop the help. I took a soil sample right in front of her and labeled it with the exact time. I told her this would be evidence in the upcoming environmental lawsuit. She tried to tell us to just spray some water on it and make it go away, but I explained that this was a grade A neurotoxin precursor and required deep earth excavation. By noon, the fire department and the Department of Environmental Quality had arrived because our sensors had automatically triggered an alert to the city. The fire chief was a no-nonsense guy named Miller, and when he heard that Brenda had blocked a hazmat crew during an active leak, his face turned a deep shade of red. He walked over to her and didn't even give her a chance to speak. He told her that she was lucky he wasn't arresting her for reckless endangerment right then and there. Brenda tried to pull her president card, but Miller just laughed and told her that her authority ended where public safety began. He ordered a mandatory evacuation of the 3 surrounding houses, including hers. Brenda was forced to leave her home with nothing but her purse, while we tore up her precious lawn with a backhoe to reach the source of the leak. The following week was a whirlwind of depositions and insurance adjusters. The HOA board of directors called an emergency meeting and invited me to testify as a professional witness. Brenda sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking much smaller than she had at the gate. She had traded her silk bathrobe for a sharp power suit, but her hands were shaking. I stood at the podium and played the dashcam footage from our truck. The entire room watched in stunned silence as Brenda laughed at the emergency order and told us to go to a gas station while a toxic plume spread under their homes. The other board members looked like they wanted to crawl under the table. One of them asked me for the final estimate of the damages. I cleared my throat and pulled up the spreadsheet on the projector. Between the soil remediation, the structural repairs to the 3 affected homes, and the fines from the EPA, the total was sitting at $4.8 million. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Since Brenda had officially refused entry in her capacity as the HOA president, the insurance company had already issued a preliminary denial of coverage. They argued that the damage was aggravated by intentional interference, which meant the HOA was personally liable for the entire amount. Brenda jumped up and started screaming that it was a conspiracy and that the truck was just too big for the gate. But the board members weren't listening to her anymore. They were looking at the legal bill that was about to be divided among every homeowner in the community. If they couldn't pay it through the reserve fund, they would have to issue a special assessment of nearly $50,000 per household. The mood in the room turned from shock to pure, unadulterated rage. One elderly man stood up and pointed a finger at Brenda, calling her a tyrant who had finally bankrupted them all. Brenda tried to call for order, but nobody cared about her gavel anymore. The board's attorney stepped forward and informed Brenda that they were initiating an immediate vote of no confidence and that she was being stripped of her position effective immediately. But it didn't stop there. The attorney also mentioned that the HOA would be suing Brenda personally to indemnify the association for the losses caused by her gross negligence. Her face went from pale to ghostly white. She had spent years using the HOA rules to bully her neighbors, and now those same neighbors were using the law to take everything she owned. I provided my logs and the sensor data, which proved that if we had been allowed in at 7 in the morning, the leak would have been contained to a single basement for less than $10,000. The $4.7 million difference was the direct price of Brenda's ego. I watched as the board voted unanimously to remove her, and the security guard who used to take orders from her was instructed to escort her out of the building. She tried to make one last stand at the door, shouting about her rights, but the guard just closed the door on her mid-sentence. The final chapter of the Whispering Pines saga took place in a courtroom 6 months later. Brenda had lost her house because she couldn't afford the legal fees and the mounting fines. It turned out that her interference was a violation of state environmental laws which carried potential jail time. I was called in for the sentencing phase to explain the long-term impact of the chemical spread. I told the judge that while we had successfully excavated the contaminated soil, the neighborhood's reputation was forever tarnished. Houses that used to sell for $1 million were now sitting on the market for half that because of the environmental disclosure requirements. Brenda sat in the defendant's chair looking haggard and defeated. The judge didn't show her any mercy. He noted that her actions were not a mistake, but a calculated display of power that put an entire community at risk. He sentenced her to 2 years of probation, 3,000 hours of community service cleaning up hazardous waste sites, and a massive personal judgment that ensured she would be paying back the HOA for the rest of her life. As I left the courthouse, I saw the homeowner who had first called us. He was finally moving out, and he stopped to shake my hand. He told me that the neighborhood had never been more peaceful now that Brenda was gone. The new HOA board had dismantled almost all of her petty rules and had even installed a dedicated emergency lane at the front gate. I drove past Whispering Pines one last time on my way to a new job. I saw a crew of workers removing the gold-plated sign Brenda had commissioned for the entrance. They were replacing it with a simple stone marker. In the end, Brenda's legacy wasn't the perfect lawn or the strict bylaws she loved so much. Her legacy was a cautionary tale about what happens when a small amount of power meets a total lack of common sense. I looked at the gate where she had once stood in her bathrobe, and I realized that the trash had finally been taken out. We moved on to the next call, ready to handle whatever mess the next person created, but I doubted anyone would ever top the HOA queen of Whispering Pines. Justice wasn't just served, it was professionally remediated, and the ground was finally clean again.